Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. This is a video to savour, so put yourself a kettle on and make a cup of coffee because we're taking a look at 6 not so well known classics. Have you heard of any of these? Well, without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? So one of the things I'm frequently asked on this channel is to recommend or show some lesser known classics. And there's 2 little issues I run into when considering this topic. One is that some books can be referred to as classics simply because of age. So that doesn't necessarily put them into the classics with a capital C. Another issue can be that these works, I could say, are lesser known classics, and yet plenty of people will have heard of them. However, the books I've picked out, I haven't read them all myself, but they're by authors who are known to be very, very good authors. Some of the works some of you will have heard of, and I can't say that they're completely obscure classics. They are classics. But they are names, or the authors' names, are not those that are recognised by the public at large, okay? So if you were to say Tolstoy, everyone knows who Leo Tolstoy is. Most people say, oh yes, War and Peace. If you mention Jane Austen, people know who that is. These authors are all excellent authors that I'm about to show you, but they're not names everybody knows. So that being said, let's take a look at 6 books which are written by excellent authors and are all highly acclaimed. The first classic on our list here is a book that I've been wanting to read for a long time. It's been on my wish list on Amazon for ages, and finally I've got hold of it. And it is The House of Ula, or I have heard this pronounced Ulloa, it's spelled U-L-L-O-A, by Emilia Pardo Bazin, if I've pronounced that correctly in Spanish, a countess from the 19th century, and a very well-respected Spanish author, this being one of her most esteemed books or works. So the story itself is set in the province of Galicia in Spain, and it follows the story of one father, young father Julian Alvarez, and when I say father I mean a priest, and he's sent to oversee the estates of the Marquis of Ulloa, or Ulloa, I'm not sure which way you pronounce it. Because this Marquis is a bit of a libertine. His name's Don Pedro, and his estates are badly handled. He's very slack. He's not particularly upright. Well, I've said he's a libertine. His estate is bleeding money, and so the Father Alvarez is sent out to sort of take care of things. And when he gets there, let's say he meets an intrigue of characters. So he very quickly recognises that Don Pedro has illegitimate children, and he himself, Father Alvarez, is quite a righteous, particular character who is very God-fearing and doesn't want to, sort of go along with or be associated with any bad practices, as if he condones it by his actions. Now, he gets there, and obviously he's troubled by certain situations as it becomes clear who is who. You see, the Marquis of Ulloa, Don Pedro, he leaves his estate in the hands of his steward, Primitivo, who is this rascal, a real rogue, who has a daughter called Sabal. Think of Isabel, sort of take the middle bit out, Sabal. And Alvarez realises quite quickly that Don Pedro's son is... his mother is Sabal, so Don Pedro's had an affair with his steward's younger daughter. So, there's a bit of seediness going on. And slowly but surely, he becomes aware of the machinations of this rogue Primitivo. And he wants to help set things right and put things on a good footing, both in a godly way and in a profitable way for the estates, and to run things right. But there is a huge amount of intrigue, almost political, involved inside it. He wants to set up a proper good marriage for Don Pedro, and takes him to a place where he can meet someone, sort of related through his uncle, whom he could marry and maybe start doing things properly. But things don't run as smoothly as he wants them to, and the nasty side and the darker sides of our characters begin to come out. Now, this was a highly acclaimed novel in its day. I think it was written in the 1880s. And some have said Emilia Pardo Bazin is very much in the style of Émile Zola. So if you've read Zola's works, then it's a naturalist. It's sort of an offshoot of the realist movement, and there's a certain amount of grittiness about this book. So I'm told, but I haven't read it myself. But that's the story as it goes. So what I'm going to do now, as is always my habit, is to read just the first paragraph. So you get a style of the writing. By the way, the translation here is the Penguin's Classics. Okay. So here's how the first paragraph goes. No matter how hard the rider tried to restrain his rough-haired nag, cajoling it with soothing words, tugging at its single rein of thin rope, the villain persisted in going down the hill at something between a stomach-churning trot and a mad, uneven gallop. And that hill, on the high road from Santiago to Orense, was certainly steep. Travellers would shake their heads and grumble about the gradient far exceeding what was permitted by law, while others muttered about the road engineers having known only too well what they were doing, and about some political bigwig in the neighbourhood, someone with real clout at election time, having had a hand in it somewhere. So that's our opening paragraph to the House of Ula, or Ulloa. You're somebody who speaks Spanish, please tell me how you pronounce this. Our second classic on our list of somewhat unknown classics is by the great author William Maxwell, the American author, who also happened to be for a while the editor of the New Yorker. And that sort of makes him a bit of a special case, because often it's thought that editors don't make great writers like novelists. But Maxwell himself, I think, wrote 6 different novels. And this one is highly respected. It's not his most popular one, but it's something I'm really looking forward to getting into. Have you read Maxwell? This one is called Time Will Darken It. What I've learned about or heard about with Maxwell, and I've known his name for a while, this too was on my wish list, I've finally gone and got it for this video, is Maxwell liked to pay attention to the little things in life that made the biggest difference. Those things which even the most detailed and voyeuristic gossip who likes every nitty-gritty detail, even the things that they would overlook, which somehow are the seeds that germinate down the line into the biggest issues of our lives. What seems innocuous at the time turns into something bigger. And this attention to detail is something that I know some have said is the reason Maxwell is not known as a great 20th century writer in the same breath of like Steinway and Hemingway, since we're talking about American authors. But it does give him a particular flavour. And I love things that deal with, I don't mind a plodding, slow story if it causes you to contemplate the little twists and turns in our lives. So the story itself focuses around Austin King. He's in a happy family situation set somewhere in the prairies of America, and he's invited over a distant group of relations called the Potters, and they come and fill up the house. They're a bit more disorganized than chaotic, and we find how a happy family, Austin King's family, starts to begin to fall apart on meeting the Potters. But as I've been told about this book, through certain very innocuous acts, through decisions which of themselves don't seem to mean anything, but they gradually grow into something much, much bigger. Because one of the Potters, one of the daughters called Nora, she falls in love with Austin, who loves his wife. But he sort of, he puts it down, I suppose, to a young crush. And so he doesn't take advantage of her, but he doesn't push her away. He's just kind to her. What's wrong with that? And we see how that begins to develop through the story, how that one little seed begins to germinate, and a load of others. Apparently brilliant little backdrop of country life as well, the different characters that you would meet, you know, your classic creaking porch kind of prairie house. And you've got the rednecks, and you've got the old lady gossips who go about in 3s and 4s, you know, do everything together and can't stop talking about the neighbourhood. all of those characters, but this is a slow story with a message to ponder over, so I've been told. Have you read anything by Maxwell? Have you read this book in particular? Let me know in your comments down below. Now, I'm going to read the first paragraph. By the way, the first paragraph in this is a great, actually it's a really nice example of in media res, so starting in the action. But this isn't with gung-ho bullets flying action or being chased down an alleyway. Just listen to this. It's called An Evening Party, 1912. In order to pay off an old debt that someone else had contracted, Austin King had said yes when he knew that he ought to have said no. And now, at 5 o'clock on a July afternoon, he saw the grinning face of trouble everywhere he turned. The house was full of strangers from Mississippi. Within an hour, the friends and neighbours he had invited to an evening party would begin ringing the doorbell, and his wife, whom he loved, was not speaking to him. I think that is, I'm very fascinated with opening paragraphs and setting a scene and getting the ball rolling quickly. And doing some writing myself, I know how hard that is, and you may have done it yourself. That, to me, was an exceptionally good paragraph. I really enjoyed how quickly that was written, and it makes me want to read more, just for the sheer style of the writing. So that was book number 2, Time Will Darken It, by William Maxwell. Our third book in this list is a book you've likely heard of if you've read the classics for some time. It's certainly an author many will know of, but still not what I would call something that's renowned. And that is Arnold Bennett's The Old Wives' Tale. Have you read this book? It's a pretty lengthy book at about 700 pages, but it moves relatively quickly. It's fascinating. And the concept upon which this book is written is just, to me, it's the stuff classics are made of. It's life. It's a reflection on life. It's an opening of the eyes to the immediate world around you and knowing it is bigger than yourself. You see, in this book, you follow two spinsters, two elderly spinsters, Sophia and Constance. I don't think there's actually an accident in those names. Constance, you think of what that means, consistency, to be constant, just to plod along, have your way of doing things. Sophia, often a name that's used because it points towards wisdom and mental development. In fact, you get sophistication, okay, to sophist, wisdom and knowledge. So we've got these two characters, and so you're going to have them, they're two sisters, by the way, and you're going to see them develop their own stories with their own personalities. But now let me tell you how this story is constructed, which makes it so fascinating. I'm going to tell you how Bennett came up with the idea. He was actually in a restaurant, and he saw a woman who, to use his words, was elderly and fat and grotesque and a couple of other words which weren't particularly nice. Now, don't judge him here. He's just being descriptive. He was not actually casting aspersions on her character. And he was talking about her over-exaggerated gestures and mannerisms and forms of speech. Maybe she was a little loud. And he says it's the kind of character that the less educated guffaw at. In other words, these characters we see who are a little bit beyond the ordinary, I don't mean that in a good way, they sort of stand out for the wrong reasons and people might mock them. And as he was considering her behaviour and that maybe she was making a little bit of a fool of herself, maybe she had let herself go, through age, he began to think, wow, actually, at one point she was a young girl with all the mobility and the savvy and the wiles of a youngster, with all the dreams of a young lady before her. She had stories somewhere within her of her life that had slowly shaped her from that person to the person she was now, with the inexorable passage of time, which all youths feel immune to, but all succumb to. And you realise as you get older, don't you, that you stay a youth in your mind and you talk to other youths and you suddenly see that change where suddenly you're no longer the youth and they're speaking as if, You've never been young before. Have you ever been there? It's that story. And so that's where he gets the idea. He takes two sisters of different temperaments and dispositions, Constance and Sophia, and he tells their backstory. They start, they're older ladies, but he tells the backstory of how they were once young, how they fall in love, whether there's marriage, disasters, troubles through life, and takes them through. Now, he starts with both of them. The book is cut into 4 parts. He then goes into part 1, where he follows the life of one sister, part 2, where he follows the life of another sister, part 2 and part 3, and part 4, where he brings it back all together. This is what classic literature is all about. It's about the story. It is about life. It is about people. It is about something we all experience. We were all young once. We will all be old, and we all lived a life of ups and downs, of love and hate, of triumph and disaster. That's what makes this book so great. On top of that, Bennett's writing is some of the best writing out there. I'm going to read you the first paragraph, which happens to be really long in this book. It's almost a page long, and it's just so well written. Talk about describing a situation. It's just fantastic. Listen to this. It's called The Square, Chapter 1. Those two girls, Constance and Sophia Baines, paid no heed to the manifold interest of their situation, of which indeed they had never been conscious. They were, for example, established almost precisely on the 53rd parallel of latitude. A little way to the north of them, in the creases of a hill famous for its religious orgies, rose the River Trent, the calm and characteristic stream of Middle England. Somewhat further northwards, in the near neighbourhood of the highest public house in the realm, rose 2 lesser rivers, the Dane and the Dove, which, quarrelling in early infancy, turned their backs on each other, and the one by favour of the Weaver, and the other by favour of the Trent, watered between them the whole width of England, and poured themselves respectively into the Irish Sea and the German Ocean. What a county of modest, unnoticed rivers! What a natural, simple county, content to fix its boundaries by these tortuous island brooks with their comfortable names: Trent, Mease, Dove, Tern, Dane, Meese, Stour, Tame, and even Hasty Severn. Not that the Severn is suitable to that county. In the county, excess is deprecated. The county is happy in not exciting remark. It is content that Shropshire should possess the swollen bump, the Wrekin, and that the exaggerated wilderness of the Peak should lie over its border. It does not desire to be a pancake like Cheshire. It has everything that England has, including 30 miles of Watling Street, and England can show nothing more beautiful and nothing uglier than the works of nature and the works of man to be seen within the limits of the county. It is England in little, lost in the midst of England, unsung by searchers after the extreme, perhaps occasionally somewhat sore at this neglect, but how proud in the instinctive cognizance of its representative features and traits. I could have read that better, to be honest. I hope you appreciate how brilliant that writing was. One of the phenomenal things about that bit of writing is how it sets up the book on its theme of exploring the life of everyone, the ordinary person. Because that's the thing about Sophia and Constance. We look at old ones and we might think they don't have any interest or past. Everyone has a story. And so setting up the county of Shropshire like he does, where there is no extremes. You know, the River Severn is one of the has amongst the greatest volume of water in the British rivers, but Britain doesn't have any truly great rivers. You know, there's nothing like the Danube in Britain, certainly not like the Mississippi or the Nile or the Amazon. But the Severn is a little too rough for the county. You know, it's a bit extreme. It's content with these little rivers that England and Wales are full of. And what he's painting there, almost subliminally to get us the tone of the book, is an ordinary, unremarkable county which nonetheless possesses all the features of all of England in a little space. In other words, it's an everyday county. And it gives us the backdrop for the everyday person and the great stories that lie behind a visage which we wouldn't expect to find those stories behind. So that was the third book, The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Have you read it? The fourth book on our list is a book which is neither novel, and saying it's even a novella is pushing it a bit, because this is a very short story indeed, and it is A Dress Unknown by Catherine Cressman Taylor. Do you know this book? You should do. This is a book that everyone should know. This is the 20th century's Uncle Tom's Cabin, said Kurt Vonnegut. And what he was talking about was, this book was written in 1938. So before World War II breaks out and before the death camps in Germany start working their hideous sort of scourge on the face of human history. In this book, we find two Jews, Max and Martin, both live in America. They went to America after World War I because, of course, Germany, if you know, after World War I was put under such strict reparations to pay that it broke the country. Now, these two brothers, Max and Martin, not sure if they're brothers, they're friends. They go to America, they start a gallery, an art gallery. But then the Nazi party comes in. Hitler comes in. The economy starts to pick up in Germany, and one of them, Max, goes back to Germany, even though he's a Jew. And what this book details is just a bunch of letters back and forth between Martin and Max, showing that awful slope into what would become the Holocaust. And it's just a remarkably eye-opening bit of writing. Like, I mean, it bites you at the end, like really bites you. You can read this in an hour or 2 hours, depending on your speed of reading. It won't take you long at all. But what you basically get is, here we've got Martin back in, Max back in Germany, and he understands that there is a bit of negativity towards the Jews, but he's a proud German. And he thinks Hitler overall is doing a good job. And, you know, maybe one or two people have to suffer, but overall it will be fine. And then you begin to see him say to Martin later, very quickly actually, stop sending me letters because it could put me in jeopardy. And then you've got family relations in there. And these little letters build up to just show you the awful situation that was growing around the Jews and this recognizing of the problem. I once heard a Holocaust survivor, she actually said, and I think this is what this book does so well, she actually said, why, people always ask us, why didn't you get out when the Nazis were, you know, persecuting the Jews? And she says it's because it didn't all happen at once. It was bit by bit by bit. And oh, see, they're being mean to us this way now. Oh, they've added this on top of it, but it will get better. Oh, they've added another thing. She says, until we ended up having the Star of David put on us, and then we realised we were trapped. Okay? We look back in history and we think things just happen like that. It's never the way. It's like, how do you boil a frog? You know, you start it in cold water and slowly turn the temperature up, and it doesn't realise until it's too late, it doesn't jump out. This is what this book will follow, and Vonnegut said that this is to our generation, or his generation, the contribution to the recognition of World War II as Uncle Tom's Cabin was to slavery in the 19th century. Have you heard of this book? I would highly recommend you get hold of this, and I'll have to do a bigger video on this book, because there are some great books out there about the situation in Nazi Germany, but this one, this came before them all. Remember, 1938. This was, Taylor had already seen what was coming. And because we know what happened the following year with the outbreak of the Second World War, and 1941 was it, the final solution, it makes it all the more horrifying to read what it must have been like in those days. So, a book that, if you've read it, leave your comments down below. If you haven't, tell me, are you going to go and get it? So that was A Dress Unknown by Catherine Cressman Taylor. The fifth book on our list of lesser known classics but really good works is by Arthur Morrison. Have you heard of this author? He was quite influential. He was very popular in his time. This one's called A Child of the Jago, and we'll come to it in a minute. But I just want to tell you a bit about Arthur Morrison. Arthur Morrison was interested in the East End of London, the slums, okay? The awful condition of the poor. And the East End was a particularly bad area, terrible for crime, for depredations, for poverty, for typhus outbreaks, for prostitution, for you name it, the East End had it. And even within the East End, there were neighbourhoods which were worse than others. This book focuses in on arguably the worst of all the neighbourhoods, which was the Old Nickel, which he renames here the Jago. Okay, it's made up of what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's made up of about 6 to 7 streets, flanked by 2 main streets like Shoreditch Highway, which is still there today. And he builds his story about one of the young lads in the Jago. So amongst the streets, there's one called New Jago, one called Old Jago, Half Jago, and just off Old Jago, there's a little court called Jago Court, where a lot of fighting goes on and brawls and you know, boxing matches. Just to say about Arthur Morrison as well, he had written, years before this book, he'd written a book called Mean Streets. That wasn't so much a novel as it was an exploration of the streets of London. Authors of the early 1900s would speak about Arthur Morrison, saying, who of us when we were younger were not terrorised by Arthur Morrison's works? Reminding them just how awful the state of living was for the poor of London. Now, he also wrote detective novels, by the way, in which one of them has a very unusual, and I haven't read this, but he has a very unusual detective who will commit armed robbery and murder. I'll tell you who that reminds me of. I've never watched the programme, but there's a programme on Netflix, isn't there, called Lucifer? And apparently it's a serial killer who works out what other serial killers have done, and then bumps them off, kind of thing. Lo and behold, that idea was way back in the 1880s, 1890s with Mr. Morrison here. Anyway, coming to the Jago, what a great book. When I say it's a great book, in styles or in form of structure and stylistics, is it a great classic? No. Is it a good yarn? Yeah, it's a good read. It's an enjoyable story. 2 things at which, but it's not like great, but 2 things are particularly noteworthy about this book. Realism is a movement. So if you're trying to teach yourself, get more familiar with literature, you know realism is one of the big movements. I would read this book if you want to understand realism more fully. One of the features is he doesn't hold back describing the most mundane of things, and by that I don't mean he's slow. He's not. This book's only about 160 pages long, so he has to move on with it. But he describes the conditions of the poor. He describes the buildings they're in. He describes how all the streets don't have front doors because they've all been used for firewood. And it's one of those extraordinarily rough neighbourhoods, and yet all the doors are left open. In fact, if you possess a front door, people think you've got pretensions to grandeur, kind of thing. He talks about the various families that inhabit the area, notably the Learys and the Rands, who constantly in battle through the year. They only unite when the Jago community takes on the Dove Lane community, which is another district a bit further north of them. But the actual story follows a young lad called Dickie Perrott, who's about 7 years old when you first meet him. And in the realist way of writing, he uses the East End speech, you know, lots of dropped H's, lots of J's instead of CH, you know, J, what do you want, instead of what do you want. So that's a realist way of writing at the time. You think of, I think Eliot does the same thing when she writes about her characters. She gives them all that accent, that country accent. So does Hardy. This is East End. You get tons of expressions which the East End slums would know. Of course, you get Cockney rhyming slang comes from this area. You don't really get the rhyming slang in this, but you get those certain expressions, and it's such a colourful thing. It reminds us that time hasn't changed. You know, people talk about being part of the hood today as if that's a new development. It's not. It's been around since time immemorial in suburbs and dark alleyways of even ancient Rome had its equivalent. This was the 1890s of Britain, and it was destitute, broken. And what you get in the story, you see running fights, you see brutality, you see drunkenness, you see the inability of the poor to think ahead one day. They'd rather have 1 shilling now than wait a month to get a job that pays them forevermore. They can't sort of break the cycle of just the immediate gratification. And Dickie Perro, he's involved in all this, and you know, everyone's proud of being part of the Jago. You don't tell on each other. The police hardly ever come in. It's too dangerous. And when they do come in, it's in full force, you know, in order to solve something. You'll see women fighting in this. One woman in particular, what's her name? Sarah. Is it Sarah Leary? Might be. She's an absolute awful how she fights with other people. It's quite disturbing, to be quite honest. Then you've got other characters called like Weech. He supposedly runs a business, but he actually gets the young lads to rob things for him. But Dickie tries to improve his position, and this is the point Morrison is trying to make. And I need to do another video on this. It's so good. But Dickie, can he improve his position, or is he sort of destined to always be a criminal, cut off from the world against the Jago kind of thing? Because that is how a lot of the poor saw themselves. That's how a lot of the reformers wanted to change that at the time, and how others from higher classes didn't think it was possible to reform these vicious cretins who inhabited the slums of East London. The whole story is fantastic. You know, it's not the best tale in the world. The way it ends, you knew, I'm pretty much sure Morrison started with that end in mind. But the way it's brought about, it's just a vivid living of that time. It's something you should read so that you can get to know the backdrop of history. When you're reading Victorian novels, to know what some of the circumstances were like that people lived in, and how vicious some people could be, read A Child of the Jago by Arthur Morrison. It is well worth your time. Now I'm just going to read you the first paragraph. It was past the mid of a summer night in the old Jago. The narrow street was all the blacker for the lurid sky, for there was a fire in a farther part of Shoreditch, and the welkin was an infernal coppery glare. Below, the hot, heavy air lay a rank oppression on the contorted forms of those who made for sleep on the pavement. And in it, and through it all, there rose from the foul earth and the grimed walls a close, mingled stink, the odour of the Jago. Pretty dramatic, isn't it? Very atmospheric. We get that filthy side. You notice how people were contorted forms, were shuffling to sleep on the pavement. Okay, not even in the houses, because it's that packed, this neighbourhood. You know, so like a square mile with 8,000 people stuffed into it. And then the smell of the Jago. It's that stink, a close mingled stink. Such brilliant writing. And from that point on, Morrison doesn't let up in describing the neighbourhood of the East of London. Our sixth and final book on our lesser known classic list is a book by Bruce Chatwin. I don't know if you've even heard of him. His life, unfortunately, he died when he was 49. He was born in 1940, he died in 1989. This is his most famous work, On the Black Hill. And it follows the life, it's very interesting how he puts this story together. So it follows the life of Benjamin and Lewis. They're two Welsh brothers who don't ever escape their farmstead. They grow up on a farm with a father, Amos, and the mother, and they've got a sister as well. And they're of two different dispositions. It's a bit like Sophia and Constance in The Old Wives' Tale. You've got two brothers with different dispositions, but it's placed more deliberately, as you'll see in a moment. Well, basically what it follows is the fact that it follows their somewhat unchanging, mundane life, but takes a very deep exploration of the human condition. Because the two boys are different, and they grow up to be men, you know? They sleep in the same bed, which used to be their parents' bed. They work the same farm. There's a discontent in Lewis. He wants to break free. Benjamin, on the other hand, is a more introspective character, very much like his mother. Lewis a bit more like the father, who was wilder. But what's so interesting about this book is the way that Chatwin sets it up to clearly divide life, to make it clear that he's separating, sort of comparing the dual elements of living. Because you've got Benjamin and Lewis themselves who are different dispositions. But that's just like their mother and father. The mother liked to read, she liked to better herself. The father was ignorant and brutish. He was very aggressive, given to drink, but the mother was nurturing and kind. This is also borne out in the fact that the house is on the border of Gloucestershire in Britain, and which is an English county, and Radnorshire, which if you look on a map is part of Wales. It says in the book that it's thought the border of England and Wales goes straight through their staircase. So you get this split. It's almost a deliberate split by Chatwin to show the different aspects of life. And so you go through their story. And, you know, like I say, they never leave home. There's a focus around their small little village community. But even so, it's like Shropshire in the Old Wives' Tale. It is England in miniature. Now we're even smaller, and we're talking the eternal questions of the human experience in miniature. Because no matter where you are, you can only inhabit a finite frame and a finite point of reference in your environment. And so the bigger questions of life are sort of held up for examination through this piece of work. And I won't say any more. It won't take you long to read this, about 220 pages. But Chatwin, this is the only book I really know of from Chatwin. So getting it, I'll read through it again. I'll do a video on this one because I know it's well worth the time. And maybe I'll even go and get some more Chatwin. But have you ever read On the Black Hill? Or have you read any of the books that we've mentioned in this video? I'll just read you the very first paragraph to this. 2 paragraphs actually, because the first one's like a sentence. For 42 years, Lewis and Benjamin Jones slept side by side in their parents' bed at their farm, which was known as The Vision. The bedstead, an oak 4-poster, came from their mother's home at Bryn Drynog when she married in 1899. Its faded cretonne hangings, printed with a design of larkspur and roses, shut out the mosquitoes of summer and the draughts in winter. Calloused heels had worn holes in the linen sheets, and parts of the patchwork quilt had frayed. Under the goose feather mattress there was a second mattress of horsehair, and this had sunk into 2 troughs, leaving a ridge between the sleepers. Such an ordinary, mundane, non-colourful way to start a book. Tells you everything you need to know right at the beginning. This is ordinary life. But you can question the extraordinary parts of existence through the most simple of lives. And that's what Chatwin does through this book. So there are our 6 classics that are lesser known by a lot of people, but all very worth reading. So that was The House of Ula, or Ulloa. It was Time Will Darken It by Maxwell. It was Address Unknown by Taylor. We had The Old Wives' Tale by Bennett, The Child of the Jago by Morrison, and On the Black Hill by Chadwick. So there you go. Which one of those appealed to you the most? Let me know in the comments down below, and feel free to share this video with anyone or any group you belong to who maybe are looking for something a little bit different in the classic vein. And believe me, if you recommend these to them, they will be happy with your recommendations. Until the next time I make a video, I wish you joy in whatever you are reading.